Alright, let's get cracking. So first things first, drag the floor prefab out of the standard assets pack, stick it in the hierarchy, and then for a little bit of perspective, we're also going to drag the house prefab and stick that anywhere you like. That's just so you can get a sense of how big the objects you're creating are. So create an empty game object, call it campfire, reset the transform so it's in the right place. And under the video there should be a link to download 3 different textures. So if you've stuck them in the textures folder, that's where they'll be. And you just need to go and check the texture type and make sure it's set to Sprite, 2D and UI for all 3 of them. That will make sure that the transparency comes through and it deals with it as if it's a sprite rather than as a texture. And that's what we need because we're going to be rendering 2D objects, which are the fire particles, in a 3D context, which is our game. Now if you open up the materials folder and create a new material, call it particle_fire, and drag the fire texture onto the albedo slot. Then you want to select cutout under rendering mode. So that will only render the fully opaque bits of the texture, which is what we want for this effect. Now you want to go to campfire, select it, right click on it, and go to Effect Particle System. That'll create a default particle system. Change the name to something appropriate like Particles Fire. And now we're going to tell the particle system to use our fire sprite as the material for its particles. So just drag the material onto that slot. Now we're going to rotate it and then plug in all the different parameters of the particle system that will make it look like an actual fire. Now you can customize this all you want later, but for now just pause the video and type out the values that you see on screen into the corresponding fields. So just to briefly interrupt, if you select size over lifetime, you'll see this little graph at the bottom right. This is fully customizable, but for now just select the downward sloping preset pattern like the one you can see on screen. I would also recommend ticking the rotation over lifetime box and just whacking any number in there to give it a bit of life sideways. You know how fire is. Anyway, so it kind of looks like a fire now, but we need to add sound. So add an audio source component to your campfire object. You can download the audio file from the video description. I've stuck it in my sound subfolder, but you could stick it anywhere, and just drag it onto the audio clip slot. So always be careful not to do these changes in play mode. Once you've ticked play on awake and loop, you should hear on startup the sound of your fire crackling merrily away. So just to make it a little bit more convincing, we're going to add a light source to our game object. Lighting in Unity is a massive topic, and there's loads of different ways to create the right ambience for your scene. But all we really want is to make it a little bit more convincing, so just stick an orange point light in there. Give it a little bit of range and a little bit of intensity, but you'll have to tweak all the values yourself to make sure your scene looks just right. Now we're going to add some smoke to our fire. Create a new particle system, give it the right name, create a new material for smoke, and drag your smoke texture onto it. Now the settings for this are going to be slightly different. We're going to use the Particles Alpha Blended shader instead of the standard shader with the cutout mode that we used earlier. This will take into account the gradual fade into transparency that our texture uses. Now just like before, drag the material onto the material slot in your particle system under the renderer tab. So this is mostly going to be the same kind of settings that we used for fire. We're going to set the lifetime of them to 10 though, rather than 5, because we want the smoke to linger around a bit longer. We also want to rotate the particle system so it faces upwards. Now just copy out the things you see on the screen. So now you'll want to move the particle systems around to get just the right shape. Oh my god. Okay, so you might have noticed that the fire is being lit up by the light underneath it. This is wrong, so let's change the shader on our particle fire material to unlit, transparent cutout. That will stop it from receiving light and casting shadows and that sort of thing. Luckily these changes can be done when you're in play mode. So this is how our fire currently looks. I think it could use a little bit more tweaking, so I'm just going to move my smoke up. For all of this your mileage may vary, just do whatever feels right for you. So let's create a new material and call it particle_spark, or sparks. Anyway, we're going to drag our sparks texture onto the albedo of that, and we're going to change the shader to unlit, transparent cutout, because these really are just going to be little sprites that fire out and don't need any transparency or anything. Create another particle system. You should be pretty good at this by now. Call it particles_sparks. Now copy the values that you see over the video. So now, just like before, we're going to select the downward sloping curve for size over lifetime, and we're going to tick rotation over lifetime as well. This will make them spin a little bit and also fade as time goes on. Since they're scaled down so much, they won't really fade, they'll just sort of look like they've disappeared into nothing. And don't forget, you can tweak all of those particle system settings to create different kinds of fires for different purposes. Isn't that nice?